She had been many things in her 24 years, a daughter, a healer, a keeper of secrets, but she had never once imagined she would become a det. If you are already feeling the pull of this story, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a tale like this one. Stories of courage, of love forged in the most impossible of places, and of women who refused to be only what the world decided they were worth. The morning Elara Ashwood learned of her fate began like any other in the cramped, medicine-scented rooms above her father's apothecary on Martin Street, Bristol. She had risen before dawn, as was her habit, grinding dried willow bark into powder with the smooth, familiar motion that had occupied her hands since she was old enough to reach the mortar. The fire in the small grate needed coaxing. The cat, a one-eyed tabby she called Galen after the ancient physician, wound silently between her ankles. Outside, the late October fog pressed itself against the window panes like something trying to get in. She did not hear her father come downstairs. That alone should have warned her. Dr. Reginald Ashwood was not a quiet man. He moved through his own home the way he moved through everything, with confident, careless noise, knocking elbows against door frames, humming half-remembered hymns, filling rooms with the particular energy of a man who had never once believed himself unwelcome anywhere. But that morning he descended the narrow staircase without a sound, and when Elara turned from her workbench and found him standing in the doorway, gray-faced and diminished, the pestle went still in her hand. Father. He could not look at her directly. That too was wrong. Reginald Ashwood had many flaws. She had catalogued them over the years with the same methodical precision she applied to everything, but cowardice in the face of his daughter had never been among them. He was a man who laughed too loudly, drank too freely, and loved with genuine, if inconsistent warmth. He had taught her to read a patient's pulse before she could properly write her own name. He had defended her right to study medicine at a time when every respectable door was closed to women. He was not a good man in the careful, disciplined sense of the word, but he had always looked her in the eye. Until now. Sit down, my dear, he said. His voice had the quality of old paper, thin, dried out, on the verge of crumbling. I would rather stand. She set down the pestle. What have you done? He told her. It took some time, and she let him speak without interruption, because she had learned long ago that interrupting her father only sent him spiraling into defensive tangents from which the actual truth could take an hour to extract. She listened. She watched his hands, which could not be still, twisting the hem of his waistcoat the way a child twists a blanket. And she assembled the facts as they came, the way she assembled a diagnosis, collecting symptoms, identifying patterns, bracing herself for the conclusion that the evidence made inevitable. He had been gambling again. She had known that or suspected it, from the quiet disappearances, the excuses, the mornings he returned home with the particular hollow look of a man who had handed pieces of himself across a card table. What she had not known, what he had concealed with surprising effectiveness, was the scale. It was not a few pounds this time, nor even 100. The number he named sat in the air between them like something physical, like smoke, like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripples move through her. The debt was owed to one man, Adrian Cavendish, the Duke of Elmore. She knew the name, as did everyone in the west of England who read the papers or listened to gossip, which was to say everyone. The Duke of Elmore was spoken of in the particular hushed, fascinated tone that society reserved for men who had become more legend than person. He had gone to war. He had come back, or something had come back wearing his shape. There were stories. There were always stories. That he had lost his mind on the continent. That he had killed a man in a fit of rage. That the servants at Velmore Hall left food outside his chamber door and ran. That he had not been seen in polite society in 3 years. That even his own family would not visit the estate. He has called in the debt, her father said. I cannot pay it. I have nothing left to pay it with. Then we sell the apothecary. We sell the house. I tried to negotiate those terms. Reginald finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was not defiance, but devastation, which was somehow worse. He refused them. The silence between them stretched. What, Elara said carefully, did he ask for instead? Her father's answer was so quiet she made him repeat it. Even the second time, it took a long moment for the meaning to fully land. The way the pain of a serious wound sometimes arrives a breath after the injury itself. The Duke of Velmore had heard of Reginald Ashwood's daughter. Word had reached him, through what channel her father claimed not to know, that she was a physician in practice if not in name, trained by her father, possessed of unusual diagnostic skill, and willing to treat the patients no respectable doctor wished to take on. The poor, the desperate, the complicated cases that paid nothing and cost everything. The Duke had lost 3 physicians in as many months. Not to death, her father was careful to clarify. To fear, to professional pride, to the simple unwillingness to remain in a house with a man who threw things and screamed in 4 languages and had once, reportedly, overturned an entire medical cabinet because the attending physician had called him hysterical. He wanted Alara, not in marriage. Her father stressed this with pathetic urgency, as though it were the point most worth clarifying. He wanted her skills. He wanted a physician who would stay. He was offering the full cancellation of all debt, every penny, in exchange for 1 year of service at Velmore Hall. 1 year. She would not be permitted to leave the estate. She had until the following morning to present herself at his gates. Alara stood very still in the medicine-scented kitchen, while her father's words settled into her bones. She thought about the life she had built here, the patients who came to her back door, the women who could not afford the physician on the high street, the children with fevers, and the old men with lungs full of coal dust, the careful, quiet dignity of work that mattered. She thought about her medical texts stacked beside her narrow bed, the correspondence she had been conducting with a female physician in Edinburgh, who said there were women breaking into the profession through sheer, relentless persistence, that it was possible, that the world was slowly, so slowly, beginning to move. She thought about her father, standing in the doorway of his own ruin. She thought about the Duke of Velmore, a man who had eaten 3 physicians alive and was somehow still in need of a 4th. "You understand," she said at last, her voice remarkably steady for a woman whose entire future had just been rearranged without her consent, "that by agreeing to this, I am not forgiving you." Her father nodded. He had the grace not to look relieved yet. "You understand that 1 year is 1 year, and when it ends I return here with the debt discharged, and we will have a very long conversation about the apothecary's accounts." Another nod. "And you understand," she continued, pulling her apron from her waist and folding it with precise, controlled movements, "that whatever this Duke believes he has purchased, he has not purchased my silence or my compliance. He has purchased my medical knowledge and my time. Those are the terms I will present to him, and if he does not like them, he may take the matter up with you." She did not sleep that night. Not from fear, exactly, or not only from fear. It was something more complicated, more alive, the sensation of standing at the edge of something that had not yet revealed its shape. She packed her medical bag with methodical thoroughness. Her instruments, her reference texts, her dried herbs and tinctures, the small locked case where she kept the medicines that required careful handling. She packed a second bag with clothes. She packed a third with the Edinburgh letters and her own notebooks, years of observations and case studies written in the cramped shorthand she had developed, so her father could not easily read them. At dawn, she hired a cart and driver. The road north into the moors was long and grew longer as the day wore on, the neat hedgerows of the Bristol outskirts giving way to rougher country, wilder, the sky pressing lower and darker, as though it were leaning in to see what she would do. By the time Velmore Hall emerged from the fog on the horizon, towers first, then the long dark mass of the house, then the iron gates, the light had gone the color of pewter, and the wind carried the smell of rain and something colder beneath it. Alara looked at the gates of Velmore Hall. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. She thought, he is sick. That is why he needs a physician. Whatever else he is a patient. And patients, in her experience, were always, at their core, simply frightened. She thought, I have treated frightened people before. She squared her shoulders, walked to the gate, and knocked. The gates did not open immediately. Alara stood in the thickening fog for long enough that the cart driver behind her made a quiet sound of unease, and she turned to pay him before he could lose his nerve entirely and take her luggage back to Bristol with him. By the time she turned back, a small door cut into the larger gate had swung inward, and a woman stood in the gap, middle-aged, angular, with the expression of someone who had long ago made peace with expecting the worst. Miss Ashwood. It was not a greeting so much as a confirmation, the way one confirms the arrival of a difficult weather system. Yes. Elara stepped through, without waiting to be invited. The grounds of Velmore Hall were enormous, and in a state of partial neglect that told a specific story. This was not the neglect of poverty. The bones of the estate were magnificent, the stone work of the house ahead staggeringly grand. This was the neglect of a place that had stopped being maintained with pride and was now only being maintained enough to prevent collapse. The topiaries had grown shaggy. The gravel path was edged with creeping weeds. Several windows on the upper floors were dark in a way that suggested they had been dark for a long time. "I am Mrs. Calloway," the woman said, leading her at a brisk pace toward the house. "Housekeeper, I will show you your rooms and explain the household rules. I would prefer to see the Duke first." Mrs. Calloway's stride did not break, but something in her shoulders tightened. "His Grace does not receive visitors in the evening. I am not a visitor. I am his physician. If I am to begin assessing his condition, I should do so without delay." Elara kept her voice pleasant and her pace even with the housekeepers. "A day's travel has not diminished my ability to conduct a preliminary examination, and from what I understand, His Grace has already waited longer than is medically advisable for proper care." Mrs. Calloway stopped walking. She turned and looked at Elara with an expression that cycled through several emotions before landing on something that might, in better light, have been cautious respect. The last physician who insisted on an immediate introduction left the estate before morning. "I am not the last physician." A pause. Then Mrs. Calloway resumed walking. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose you are not." The interior of Velmore Hall was all dark wood and high ceilings, rooms that had once been magnificent and were still grand in the involuntary way of things built to outlast the people inside them. Candles rather than lamps. Fires that heated without warming. If that distinction made sense, the rooms were technically not cold, but there was no comfort in them. The servants Elara passed moved quickly and quietly, eyes averted, with the particular body language of people accustomed to making themselves small. She catalogued everything. It was a habit she could not turn off. Mrs. Calloway led her not to a drawing room or a study, but to a set of double doors on the ground floor's east wing. She stopped outside them and lowered her voice. "He will likely be unpleasant. He may shout. He has not, a small hesitation. He has not struck anyone. But he throws things. I want you to know that before you go in." "Thank you," Elara said. "That is genuinely useful information." She knocked. 3 firm, unhurried knocks. Silence. Then I said I was not to be disturbed. The voice was deep, roughened, with the particular texture of a voice that had recently been used for shouting, and before that, perhaps, for years of disuse. It came from some distance inside the room, which meant it was a large room, and he was not near the door. "You also said you needed a physician," Elara replied through the door. "I have arrived. I would rather introduce myself tonight than wait until morning, as it gives me the opportunity to conduct a preliminary assessment before you have time to prepare yourself to appear healthier than you are." A very long silence. Then the sound of something being set down with controlled force, not thrown, but communicating clearly that throwing had been considered. Footsteps. The door opened. He was tall. That was the first thing, taller than she had expected, filling the doorframe in a way that required her to adjust her initial spatial calculations. The second thing was the scar that ran from his left temple to the jawline, silver white and old, the kind of scar that had taken months to heal and had not healed cleanly. The third thing, which she noted with the swiftness of clinical habit before she could note anything else, was that he was in pain. Not emotional pain, though that was present too, visible in the set of his jaw and the tightness around his eyes, but physical pain, the kind that had been living in a body, so long it had become part of the architecture. She could see it in the way he held his left shoulder, The slight favoring of his right leg, the pallor beneath the weathered skin that spoke of something systemic and ongoing. The Duke of Elmore looked at her with gray eyes that were sharp and furious and exhausted in equal measure. He looked at her medical bag. He looked at her face. "You are younger than I expected," he said. "You are sicker than your correspondent suggested," she replied. "May I come in?" Something moved through his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of it. He stepped back from the door. It was not precisely a welcome, but it was an opening. Alara walked into the room. The study was a room that had once loved books and still did, in the desperate way of things that had been neglected but not abandoned. Shelves covered every wall from floor to ceiling, and the volumes on them were not decorative. They were read, reread, marked, some with spines so cracked they leaned against their neighbors for support. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered in papers that had the organized chaos of a mind that worked in layers. A fire burned in the grate, too large for the hour, the kind of fire a person builds when they are trying to exhaust something. Adrian Cavendish positioned himself with his back to the fire and his arms crossed, a stance Alara recognized immediately as the posture of a man who had decided that offense was the most reliable defense. "Sit," he said. "In a moment." She was already moving slowly around the perimeter of the room, not examining him directly, letting him adjust to her presence the way one lets a wary animal adjust. She set her bag on the nearest chair and unbuckled it with unhurried hands. "I would like to establish something before we discuss terms." "I set the terms." "You set the contractual terms," she agreed pleasantly. 1 year of service, the debt discharged, the estate boundaries as my limit. I have accepted those. I am speaking about medical terms, which are mine to set, and which are non-negotiable. She turned to face him. "I will treat you honestly. I will not soften findings to spare your comfort, and I will not exaggerate them to alarm you into compliance. In return, I require that you answer my questions truthfully, submit to examination when I determine it necessary, and follow the treatment protocols I prescribe. If you disagree with my methods, you may say so, and I will explain my reasoning. What you may not do is discard treatment without discussion, because the consequences of that will fall on your body, not your pride." The fire crackled. Adrian stared at her with an expression she could not yet fully read. Too many things moving beneath it, like weather beneath ice. "The last physician prescribed laudanum and bed rest," he said. "The physician before that prescribed sea air and moderate spirits. And the one before that, I understand, prescribed prayer." She met his gaze steadily. "I intend to prescribe none of those things. I intend to find out what is actually wrong with you." "The consensus," he said, with a bitterness so old it had become almost academic, "is that what is wrong with me cannot be treated, that I came back from the continent broken in ways that do not mend. The consensus has not examined you properly." She drew a small notebook from her bag. "When did the episodes of rage begin? I mean specifically, were they present immediately upon your return, or did they develop gradually?" He blinked. It was a small thing, but she caught it, the slight recalibration of a man who had prepared for many kinds of conversations and not this one. "Gradually," he said, after a moment. "How gradually? Weeks? Months? Months. The first year back he stopped. Started again. I was not easy to be around, but it was different. I was angry, but I could still reason through it. It is only in the last 18 months that I have lost that." Something like shame crossed his face, and she noted it not as weakness, but as data, a man who remembered what he had been and could measure the distance from it. "Do you sleep?" "Poorly." "Do you eat regularly?" "When I remember." "Headaches?" "Constantly." "Where?" "Describe the location and quality." He uncrossed his arms. She had noticed that too, the gradual unwinding that came when someone was being asked to describe symptoms rather than defend themselves. Pain had its own language, and speaking it was, for many people, an unexpected relief. "Behind the eyes," he said, "and at the base of the skull. Pressure rather than sharp pain. It is worse in the mornings." She wrote this down. "Do you experience tremors?" A pause. The shame again, deeper this time. In the hands. Occasionally. Sensitivity to light. Yes. To sound. Yes. She looked up from her notebook. He was watching her with an expression she would spend considerable time thinking about later. A man standing very still at the edge of something, not yet certain whether the ground would hold. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was careful, but not gentle in the condescending sense. Careful in the way of someone carrying something that mattered. "What you have described to me in the last 4 minutes is not madness. It is a collection of symptoms that have a cause. And causes, in my experience, can generally be treated." She closed the notebook. "I will need to conduct a thorough physical examination tomorrow morning, and I will need to review everything you have eaten and drunk in the last 3 months, including any medicines the previous physicians prescribed." He was quiet for a long moment. "Why the food and drink?" he asked. "Because several of your symptoms are consistent with something I want to rule out." She kept her expression neutral. It was too early to say what she suspected. Suspicion without evidence helped no one. Standard protocol. Adrian Cavendish looked at her across the firelit room. The fury that had been present in his face at the door had not disappeared, but it had shifted, moved to the back of the room, so to speak, to make space for something more complicated. "You are not what I expected," he said. "So I have been told." She buckled her medical bag. "I will see you at 8 tomorrow morning. Please do not eat or drink anything before I arrive except water from a sealed vessel." She paused at the door. "And your Grace, sleep if you can. Whatever I determine tomorrow, rest is not the enemy." She left him standing by the fire. The examination took 2 hours. Alara had conducted examinations in worse conditions, on kitchen tables by candlelight, in cramped tenement rooms with 3 families watching, once in a stable, because the patient had refused to move indoors. She was not easily unsettled by the clinical intimacy of the work. But examining Adrian Cavendish required a particular kind of steadiness, because he submitted to it with the rigid, furious dignity of a man doing something that cost him enormously. And she understood that the cost was not physical modesty, but something deeper. The exposure of evidence he had perhaps hoped she would not find. The battlefield injuries alone told a story that made her jaw tighten. His left shoulder had been improperly set after what appeared to have been a significant fracture. She could feel the malunion beneath her hands, bone that had healed in the wrong configuration, producing the chronic deep ache he had described as simply existing background noise, something he had stopped mentioning because he had stopped expecting anyone to address it. 3 ribs on his right side, healed, but with the particular texture of bones that had not been properly rested during recovery. A long-healed wound on his upper thigh, deep enough once to have been life-threatening. The scar tissue dense and limiting in ways that explained the subtle favoring of his right leg she had noticed the night before. She documented everything without comment. He watched the ceiling. It was when she moved to the neurological assessment, pupils, reflexes, the careful mapping of sensation and response, that she began to find what she had been looking for and hoping not to find. His pupils were slightly unequal in response to light, the left slower than the right. His reflexes were inconsistent in ways that were not characteristic of war trauma alone. The tremor in his hands when she asked him to extend them was finer and more regular than the tremor of simple nervous exhaustion. And there was the color of his nail beds, the faint grayish tinge at the half-moons, the pallor of the inner lower eyelid. She sat back. "You have been poisoned," she said. The ceiling stopped being interesting. He looked at her with an expression so perfectly, carefully blank that it confirmed he had heard her correctly and was deciding how to respond. That is a serious accusation. It is a medical finding. Whether it becomes an accusation depends on what we discover next. She kept her voice level. "The symptoms you described to me last night, the headaches, the tremors, the sensitivity, the cognitive deterioration, the rage that developed gradually over 18 months, they are consistent with chronic low-level exposure to a heavy metal compound. Arsenic is most common, but there are others." She watched his face. The previous physicians interpreted these symptoms as evidence of madness because they were not looking for a physical cause. They saw a man who had been to war and come back changed, and they built their diagnosis around that narrative. And you do not believe the narrative. I believe the war injured you, she said carefully. I believe you came back carrying things that would have broken most men. But I do not believe the war alone accounts for what I found this morning. The progression is wrong. The physical markers are wrong. She folded her hands in her lap. Someone has been making you worse. The silence in the room was of a particular quality. Not empty, but full, packed with the sound of a man rearranging everything he thought he knew about the last 18 months of his life. Who? The word came out quiet, which was in some ways more alarming than if he had shouted it. I don't know yet. I need to trace the source, your food, your medicines, your wine. It will take time and it requires discretion, because if the person responsible becomes aware that I am looking, they will either stop, which removes my ability to identify them through the pattern, or they will escalate. She held his gaze. I need you to tell no one what I have told you this morning. Not your steward, not your valet, not the housekeeper. No one. Something moved through his gray eyes, a complex, tectonic shift. Old certainties cracking along fault lines he had not known existed. You are telling me that someone in this house has been poisoning me for 18 months, and you want me to sit quietly at dinner with them. I want you to do nothing differently while I gather evidence. She paused. I understand that is an extraordinary thing to ask. He laughed, a short, harsh sound with no humor in it. It is somewhat extraordinary, yes. I also need you to understand something else. She leaned forward slightly. When I remove the source of the poisoning and begin treating the accumulated damage, you will begin to feel better. The headaches will reduce. The tremors will lessen. She chose the word with care, the episodes. They will become less frequent and less severe. This is not me offering you hope as a physician's platitude. This is a predictable medical outcome. She let that settle. You are not mad, Your Grace. You have been made to seem so. There is a significant difference. Adrian Cavendish sat in the chair across from her examination table and said nothing for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, stripped of its defensive armor, raw underneath. 3 physicians told me it was my mind. 3 physicians were wrong. Another silence. Then, quietly, what do I do? You let me work, Ilara said. And you trust me, which I recognize I have not yet earned. But I intend to. Trust, Ilara had learned, was not given in large quantities all at once. It came in small installments, irregular and often unannounced. A door left open that had previously been closed, a question asked where silence had been before, the almost imperceptible relaxation of a shoulder that had been held rigid. For so long the person inside it had forgotten what relaxed felt like. She had seen it in patients before. She knew how to be patient with the process. Adrian gave trust the way a man who had been burned gives his hand to a fire, incrementally, with frequent withdrawal, testing the temperature before committing any further. The first installment came 3 days after her examination, when she arrived at his study for the morning treatment and found him already at his desk, a medical text open before him, one of her own books, she realized, which he had left in the adjoining room. He did not acknowledge that he had been reading it. He simply closed it and pushed it to the side with studied casualness, and she simply took it back without comment. But she had seen the page it was open to. He had been reading about arsenic poisoning, educating himself about his own condition with the focused intensity of a man who had decided that understanding was preferable to being managed. She found she respected that enormously. The second installment came a week later. She had begun the treatment protocol. Chelation compounds to begin clearing the accumulated toxin, carefully sourced from her own supplies rather than the estate's, prepared by her own hands in her locked room. She had also begun the longer work of tracing the poisoning source, cataloging what he ate and drank with meticulous attention, watching the patterns. And she had begun treating the shoulder, a combination of manipulative therapy and a specific herbal compound for the inflammation that she explained in detail, because he asked, and because the questions he asked were precise and intelligent and made her explain her reasoning rather than simply her conclusions. This will not fix the malunion, she told him one morning. her hands working at the joint with careful pressure, while he sat with his eyes forward and his jaw set against the discomfort. I know that. It will reduce the chronic pain significantly. Possibly by half. Half would be a breath controlled. Half would be considerable. She worked in silence for a moment. Outside, the November wind moved across the moors with a sound like distant breathing. How long have you been in this level of pain? Since Waterloo. He said it flatly, the name of the battle carrying the particular weight of words that have been carried so long they have worn grooves into the person holding them. That is 7 years. Yes. She said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that, nothing that would not diminish it. She simply continued the work, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, but companionable in the careful way of two people discovering that they can occupy the same space without requiring anything from each other. It was in these treatment sessions that she began to see past the architecture of his defenses. He read everything: history, natural philosophy, medicine now. Latin texts she recognized as advanced, a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius that lived on the corner of his desk with the particular permanence of a book that had been a companion rather than merely a text. He was funny, occasionally, in the dry, unexpected way of people who have never performed humor, but sometimes cannot help it. Once, when she had presented him with a particularly bitter-tasting compound and watched his expression, he had said, without looking up from his book, I have eaten battlefield rations for 3 years. This is worse, and she had laughed before she could decide whether to, and the surprise on his face at the sound had lasted only a moment before something quieter replaced it. He watched her work. She became aware of it gradually. The way his attention tracked her movements when she was preparing compounds or reviewing her notes, not intrusively, but with a quality of focus that was different from the suspicious surveillance of the early days. It was closer to curiosity, closer to something she did not name yet, because naming things prematurely was as dangerous in medicine as in anything else. The household, too, was shifting around her presence. Mrs. Calloway had moved from wariness to a tentative alliance, leaving small things outside Alara's door, a better candle, a pot of good tea, once a small bunch of dried herbs from the kitchen garden with a note identifying their varieties in careful handwriting. The younger housemaids had stopped going silent when she entered rooms. The footman who brought her meals had begun to linger long enough for her to ask questions about what the Duke ate at dinner, what wines were served, who handled the preparation. She was building a picture. The picture was becoming clearer and more troubling in equal measure. One evening, returning from a consultation with Adrian that had run later than usual, she passed the corridor outside the steward's office and heard voices. Low, careful, the specific register of a conversation not meant to carry. She did not stop. She did not slow her pace. But she listened, and one sentence reached her before she turned the corner. Asterisk, she is getting too close. Something will need to be done. Asterisk. She walked to her room. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long moment, listening to her own steady heartbeat. Then she lit her candle, opened her notebook, and wrote down everything she had heard. The storm arrived on a Thursday, without much warning. The moors gave weather differently than the city. In Bristol, a storm announced itself through the behavior of people, the closing of shutters, the quickening of steps on cobblestones. Here it simply arrived, dropping out of a sky that had been pewter all morning, and was suddenly, completely, the color of iron. The snow came horizontally. By midday, the drifts against the north-facing walls were waist-high, and Mrs. Calloway had informed the household with grim practicality that the eastern and northern wings were effectively cut off from the main house until further notice. This left Alara and Adrian in the west wing with a skeleton staff, 2 fireplaces, and 3 days. The first day, they maintained careful normalcy. She conducted his treatment. He read. She updated her notes. They ate in the small dining room off the main corridor with the excessive formality of 2 people working very hard not to acknowledge that the walls had moved closer. The second day, the pretense became harder to sustain because the fire in the small dining room went out and could not be relit, damp wood, a blocked flue, and the only room with a reliable fire and sufficient space was a study, where she had been treating him anyway. So she brought her notebooks, and he did not object, and they worked in parallel by firelight while the storm pressed against the windows with insistent white hands. It was that evening that they began to talk. Not about medicine. Not about the poisoning or the treatment protocol or the careful clinical business that had structured all their previous interactions. They talked the way people talk when the world outside has contracted to a single warm room and formality becomes simply too exhausting to maintain. He asked about Bristol. She told him about the backdoor patients, the women who came before dawn so their husbands would not know they had sought help, the children with the hollow eyes of real hunger, the satisfaction and the heartbreak of work that mattered, but that the world refused to call by its proper name. She told him about her father with the careful honesty of someone who loves a person and is not blind to them. She told him about the Edinburgh physician, the letters, the distant possibility of a world where what she did was recognized. He listened in the way of someone for whom listening had become rare, completely, without the restless energy of a person waiting for their own turn to speak. In return, and gradually, he told her things. Not Waterloo, not yet, not directly, but the edges of it. The particular quality of silence after artillery. The way cold felt different in Belgium than anywhere he had known cold before. The disorientation of returning to England and finding that everyone wanted him to have come back the same, as though the version of himself that had left was the correct one, and this current version was a malfunction rather than a consequence. They kept saying I would recover, he said. The fire had burned low, and neither of them had moved to add wood, as though doing so would break something. My mother, my friends, the ones who remained friends long enough. As though recovery were a place one arrived at rather than, he stopped. Rather than something that changes shape, Ilara said quietly. He looked at her. Yes. The room was very still. She was aware, with the precise and unhelpful clarity that tends to arrive at exactly the wrong moment, of how close they were sitting. Close enough that she could see the fine detail of the old scar along his jaw, the way the firelight changed the gray of his eyes to something warmer. She was aware that the conversation had moved them, incrementally, and without either of them directing it, into territory that had nothing to do with medicine. She should have moved. She knew she should have moved. He reached out and with one careful finger pushed a loose strand of hair from her face, a gesture so quiet and unpremeditated that it seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. His hand stilled at her temple. The fire breathed. She did not move. Then he pulled back. Not quickly, not with the violence of someone retreating from a mistake, but with the deliberate care of someone choosing, consciously, to step back from an edge. Forgive me, he said. His voice was low and entirely steady, which told her the steadiness was costing him something. There is nothing to forgive. Her own voice was admirably controlled. She was quite proud of it. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the white obliteration of the storm. She looked at her notebook, which contained no new words, because she had not written anything in the past hour and a half. You should sleep, he said, without turning from the window. Yes, she agreed. She gathered her notes. At the door she paused, not turning back. Your Grace. What you said about recovery, about a changing shape. A beat. I think you are further along it than you know. She went to her room. She did not sleep for a very long time. The storm cleared. The walls moved back to their proper distance. Neither of them spoke of the evening by the fire, which was itself a kind of speech. Ilara redirected her energy into the investigation with the focused intensity of someone who needed to look at something other than the complicated interior of her own feelings. She had a pattern now. 3 weeks of careful documentation had given her enough data to see the shape of it clearly. The correlation between specific meals and the sharpest deterioration in Adrian's symptoms. The way the worst episodes clustered around the days when the estate steward, Mr. Graves, had been directly involved in the preparation or delivery of the Duke's food and wine. It was not proof. Not yet. But it was a map. Graves was a compact, watchful man of 50, with the smooth professional manner of someone who had spent decades making himself indispensable. He managed the estate accounts, the staff schedules, the household provisioning. He had been in the position for 4 years, appointed. Ilara had quietly determined through careful conversation with Mrs. Calloway, just 8 months before Adrian's symptoms had begun their serious escalation. Mrs. Calloway had not liked him from the beginning. Too tidy, she had said, which Ilara had understood to mean, a man who controls information too carefully is a man who has something to protect. The method, she now believed, was the wine. Adrian drank 1 glass of claret with dinner. She had reduced his intake as part of the treatment protocol, which had produced measurable improvement and also, she now realized, had been unconsciously disrupting the poisoning schedule. The wine came from the estate cellar, managed exclusively by Graves. She needed a sample. Getting it required timing and a degree of subtlety that she executed over 2 days. A conversation with the young footman who served dinner, a carefully casual question about the vintage currently being served, a request framed as medical protocol to examine all consumables for potential interactions with the Duke's treatment compounds. The footman, who was 17 and trusted her completely by this point, brought her a small decanted sample without question. She tested it that night using the methods her father had taught her, crude by a chemist's standards, but sufficient. The compound she was looking for had specific reactions to certain acidic solutions, produced a particular discoloration that was unmistakable once you knew what you were seeing. She sat back from her small makeshift laboratory and looked at the result for a long time. Then she wrote everything down in the careful, precise language of clinical documentation, dates, observations, methodology, findings, because she understood that what she had found needed to survive her. If something happened to her before she could present this to Adrian, the record needed to exist. She sealed the notes and hid them in the lining of her second medical bag. The following morning she was crossing the corridor toward Adrian's study when she heard footsteps behind her. Deliberate, unhurried, with the specific quality of footsteps that wanted to be heard. Miss Ashwood. Graves' voice was pleasant. A word, if you have a moment. She turned. His face was arranged in its usual smooth expression, professionally courteous, giving nothing away. But his eyes were doing something different, a careful measuring assessment, the look of a man taking the dimensions of a problem. Of course, she said. I wanted to mention, he said, falling into step beside her, that I have noticed you making inquiries about the household provisioning, about the wine cellar specifically. A small collegial smile. I want to assure you that everything is managed to the highest standard. His Grace's health is everyone's priority here. I am glad to hear it, Ilara said. My inquiries are purely routine. I review all consumables as a standard part of my treatment protocol. I do the same with all patients. Of course. The smile did not change. I simply wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. If you have questions about provisioning, I hope you'll come to me directly rather than troubling the junior staff. She met his gaze with the most uncomplicated expression she owned. That is very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Graves. She continued down the corridor. She did not increase her pace. She did not look back, but the skin between her shoulder blades was very aware of exactly where he was standing until she turned the corner. That evening, she debated telling Adrian. She turned it over carefully. The risk of telling him against the risk of not telling him. The medical reality that stress would complicate his treatment against the ethical reality that this was his life and his house and his right to know. In the end, she decided to wait 2 more days. She needed one more piece of evidence, a direct connection between Graves and the cousin she now suspected of financing the scheme. She had written to a contact in London, someone who could access property and legal records. 2 days. She simply needed 2 more days. She did not get them. She was in the cellar before she fully understood how she had gotten there. One moment she had been in the corridor outside the wine storage, candle in hand, collecting a second sample to confirm her findings. The next, a door had closed behind her with the definitive sound of a bolt being thrown, and she was standing in the dark with a single candle and the particular quality of silence that belongs to underground spaces. Total, pressurized, indifferent. She did not panic. She assessed. The cellar was stone-walled, deep, with a low ceiling and no windows. The door was solid oak, the bolt exterior. Her candle had perhaps 2 hours of life remaining. She had her medical bag, which she had carried out of habit, and which contained instruments, but nothing useful for the present situation. The temperature was perhaps 40 degrees. Cold enough to be dangerous over time, not immediately lethal. She sat down on a wine crate and thought carefully. Graves had moved faster than she had anticipated, which meant he was more frightened than she had calculated, which meant he knew she was close, which meant the evidence she had already gathered and hidden was likely sufficient. He would not have acted if he believed she still needed time to find proof. This was useful information. What was less useful was being locked in a cellar with a diminishing candle. She stood and began a methodical examination of the room. Every wall, the ceiling joints, the floor near the door. There was a narrow ventilation gap near the ceiling on the north wall, stone-latticed. Too small to pass through, but sufficient for sound. She dragged a crate beneath it and climbed up. "Hello," she said, clearly and calmly, into the gap. "If anyone can hear me, I am Miss Ashwood. I am in the north cellar. I would appreciate assistance." She waited. Said it again. Waited. Upstairs, Adrian had noticed her absence at 7 o'clock, when she did not arrive for the evening treatment. By 7:15, he had asked Mrs. Calloway, who had not seen her since afternoon. By 7:30, he had checked her room, her workroom, the study, the library. By 7:45, something cold and specific had replaced the general anxiety, the knowledge, arriving without ceremony, that this was not a simple absence. He found the footman first. The boy, white-faced, told him about the wine sample request, about Graves' subsequent questions, about seeing Graves near the cellar corridor an hour ago. Adrian did not run. He moved with the focused economical speed of a man who had been trained for worse than this. His body, remembering things his mind had spent years trying to forget. He found Graves in the steward's office, in the process of burning papers in the grate with the concentrated urgency of a man working against a clock. "Where is she?" Graves turned. Whatever he had prepared to say did not survive the look on Adrian's face. "Your Grace, I must explain. There are things about this woman you do not know. She has been conducting unauthorized investigation. She." "Where is she?" Each word its own sentence. The bolt on the cellar door, when Alara heard it thrown back, produced a sound she felt rather than heard, a full-body release of tension she had not permitted herself to consciously experience while it was happening. Light flooded in. Adrian stood in the doorway with a lamp, and behind him 2 footmen, and his expression when he saw her sitting composed on her wine crate was something she would spend considerable time afterwards trying to describe accurately to herself and failing. Relief was part of it. Fury was part of it. Something else that had no clean clinical category. "You are unharmed," he said. "Completely." She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Did you find Graves?" "Yes." "Did he attempt to explain himself?" "He attempted several things." His jaw was tight. "He is currently in the custody of the footmen, and will remain so until the magistrate arrives tomorrow." She nodded. "Good. I need to retrieve something from my room. I have documentation, evidence, dates, samples, findings." She moved toward the door. He did not step aside immediately, and for a moment they were very close in the narrow doorway, the lamp between them throwing unsteady light across both their faces. Alara, her given name, for the first time, spoken without apparent premeditation. She looked up at him. "I'm going to find the words," he said, with the careful precision of a man making a commitment he intends to keep, "for what I want to say to you. I do not have them yet, but I will." She held his gaze for a moment. "I will be here," she said. "Take your time." She stepped past him into the corridor, into the lamplight, and breathed. The magistrate came and went. Graves confessed with the deflated pragmatism of a man who understood the evidence had already spoken for him. The cousin, a Mr. Frederick Cavendish, third in line for the dukedom, had engaged Graves 18 months prior with a straightforward proposition: ensure that Adrian's deterioration continued and accelerated until he could be formally declared mentally incompetent and committed to an institution. The estate, the title, the considerable Cavendish fortune would then pass cleanly down the line. The payment had been generous. The method had been Graves' own selection. He had a working knowledge of compounds from a previous position in a pharmaceutical house, which had made him, in Frederick's estimation, the ideal instrument. Frederick was in London. Legal proceedings would follow him there. Alara presented her documentation to the magistrate with the composed precision of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment, answering questions clearly and completely, watching the official's expression move from polite skepticism to genuine attention as the evidence accumulated. When it was finished and the men had gone and the house had settled back into its altered quiet, she sat in the study across from Adrian and felt the particular exhaustion that follows sustained vigilance, the body's invoice for all the alertness it had been providing on credit. Adrian said nothing for a long time. The fire was low. Outside, December had arrived with the serious intention of making itself felt, frost patterns spreading across the window panes with slow, botanical precision. 18 months, he said finally. Yes. 18 months I spent believing. He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. I made decisions based on what I believed was true about myself. I withdrew from everything. I accepted that I was. The word seemed to cost him. Broken. I accepted it as a permanent condition and arranged my life accordingly. Alara watched him carefully. You survived an active poisoning while simultaneously managing genuine war trauma and serious physical injuries, she said. What you did during those 18 months was not weakness. It was endurance. It does not feel like endurance from the inside. It rarely does. He stood and moved to the window, a posture she had come to recognize as his thinking position, facing outward, as though the answer might be visible somewhere on the moors. She waited. She had learned the rhythm of him well enough by now to know when silence was processing and when it was avoidance. My mother wrote to me 6 months ago, he said. I did not reply. I told myself it was because I had nothing worth saying. The truth was closer to shame. A pause. There are people I owe letters to. Conversations I ended or never began because I believed the ending was already written. Then write the letters, Alara said simply. The ending has been rewritten. He turned from the window. In the weeks since she had begun the treatment properly, the poisoning source removed, the chelation progressing, the shoulder work continuing, the change in him had been measurable and visible. The tremors had reduced dramatically. The headaches were less frequent. The episodes of uncontrolled rage had not recurred once since Graves' removal, which confirmed what she had suspected, that the manipulation of his symptoms had been deliberate and timed, aggravated precisely when Frederick needed evidence of instability. What she had not entirely anticipated was what emerged as the poisoning receded. Not a different man, but a fuller one. The intelligence she had glimpsed early, unobstructed now, given to quick observation and dry, precise humor, and a quality of attention that was, frankly, difficult not to notice when it was directed at her. Which it was. Increasingly. With a directness that he seemed to have stopped attempting to conceal. And that was the problem she had been carefully not examining. The way one does not look directly at something bright. The growing, complicated, professionally inadvisable reality of her own feelings, which had been developing with the same quiet relentlessness as the frost on the window, spreading inward from the edges, covering more ground each morning. A year of service. That was the contract. For months remained. For months. And then she returned to Bristol, to the backdoor patients and the Edinburgh letters, and the life she had built, the life that had been interrupted. The life that was hers. She was almost certain she still wanted it. She was becoming less certain what it would feel like without him in it. Adrian crossed the room and sat back down across from her. He looked at her with the directness that had become characteristic of him as his health returned. No performance in it, no management of impression. Simply a man looking at the thing he was looking at. You are thinking about leaving, he said. She did not insult him by denying it. I am thinking about the contract. For months. Yes. He nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already known. Then I have 4 months, he said, to find the words I mentioned. She looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing something medically inconvenient. You mentioned you would take your time. I have been. The ghost of a smile. I did not say I would take forever. The 4 months passed the way significant time always passes, slowly in the living of it, and then suddenly gone. January brought hard frost and the first real evidence of Adrian's returning health. Not just the clinical markers she tracked in her notebook, but the larger visible things. He wrote to his mother. He received a reply within a fortnight, and though she did not ask about its contents, she found him afterward with an expression that had the raw, careful quality of someone handling something precious that they had believed lost. He began meeting with the estate manager about the grounds. He rode out onto the moors on mornings when the frost had not made it dangerous, returning with color in his face and the particular aliveness of someone rediscovering what their body was capable of. She watched all of it and said nothing about what it did to her. February brought the London proceedings against Frederick, in which Adrian's testimony, delivered by post, his solicitor managing the details, was sufficiently damning to ensure his cousin would not trouble him again. It also brought a letter from Edinburgh, from the female physician, containing information about a surgical training program opening in spring that would accept women of demonstrated competence. Ilara read the letter 3 times. She put in her notebook. She did not mention it to Adrian. March arrived, and with it the last weeks of her contracted year. The household had changed entirely around her presence. Mrs. Calloway had become something close to warm. The young housemaids sought her for minor ailments with comfortable familiarity, and the footman who had helped her that terrible night had developed an earnest interest in medicine that she had been quietly encouraging. Velmore Hall had the quality of a house waking up slowly, room by room, remembering what it was for. On the 15th of March, Ilara packed her bags. She was methodical about it, because methodology was what she had when other things failed her. She packed her instruments first, then her texts, then the notebooks. Years of them now, the Velmore observations filling 3 volumes of their own. She packed the Edinburgh letter in the front pocket of her medical bag, where she could reach it easily. She told herself she was ready. She was not ready. She carried her bags to the front hall at dawn on the 16th, the hired cart arranged for 8 o'clock. The house was quiet. She had said her goodbyes the evening before, Mrs. Calloway, the staff, the small rituals of departure. She had not said goodbye to Adrian, because he had not been at dinner, and she had told herself this was fine, that a clean ending was better, that the alternative was a conversation she was not equipped to have without the contract between them as a structural support. She sat in the front hall with her bags and waited for 8 o'clock. At 7:45 the door to the east corridor opened. He was dressed for outdoors, coat, boots, as though he had been outside already or intended to go. He stopped when he saw her. She stood. "You were going to leave," he said, without. "The contract ended yesterday," she said. "The terms were fulfilled. I thought a clean." "No." He crossed the hall. Not quickly, with the deliberate, careful movement she had come to associate with him at his most honest, when he was choosing each step consciously. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that she could see the particular gray of his eyes in the early morning light, the old scar, the face that had become over 12 months as familiar to her as her own medical texts, and considerably more disruptive. "I told you I would find the words." She could not speak. "You came here," he said, "because you had no choice. You stayed because you are the kind of person who does not abandon what she has started. You treated me when 3 other physicians decided I was not worth the difficulty. You sat in a cellar with a candle and assessed the situation. You gave me back." His voice, steady until now, shifted slightly. He steadied it again with visible effort. "You gave me back the accurate version of myself. After 18 months of being told the worst version was the true one." "That was medicine," she said. Her own voice was not entirely reliable. Some of it was medicine. His eyes held hers. "Ilara, I am not asking you to stay because you were brought here to serve. I am asking you because this house is incomprehensible to me without you in it. Because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in 40 years of life, and I have been trying very hard to find the appropriate language for that for approximately 10 months. And the appropriate language is apparently simply, please stay. Not as a physician. As whatever you are willing to be." The Edinburgh letter was in her front pocket. The cart was coming at 8 o'clock. The life she had built was in Bristol, waiting. She thought about what she wanted. She took a breath. "There is a surgical training program in Edinburgh," she said. "Beginning in spring. I intend to apply." Something careful moved through his expression. "Edinburgh," she continued, "is not Bristol. It is also not here. But it is closer to here than Bristol is." She watched his face. "I am not giving up my work. I will not be only a duchess, if that word ever becomes applicable, which we are a significant number of conversations away from." The careful expression broke into something unguarded and entirely undone. "I would not ask you to be only anything." "Then we have a great deal to discuss," she said. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with the gestures of theater, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally arrived somewhere after a very long journey. Outside, the morning light was coming over the moors, gold and unhurried, spreading across the frost like a beginning. Spring came to Velmore Hall the way healing comes, gradually, then all at once. The grounds, which Alara had first seen in the gray suspension of late October, revealed themselves to be something extraordinary beneath the frost. The gardens, coaxed back to life by a groundskeeper who had apparently been waiting years for permission to try, erupted in April with the particular exuberance of things that have been suppressed too long. The shaggy topiaries were shaped. The gravel paths were cleared. Windows that had been dark for 3 years were opened, and light moved through the upper rooms of Velmore Hall for the first time in longer than most of the staff could remember. Alara noticed all of it from the window of what had become her study, a room Adrian had converted for her use with characteristic thoroughness, fitted with proper shelving for her texts, a workbench for her compounds, and a writing desk positioned to face the moors, because he had observed that she thought better when she could see distance. She had been accepted to Edinburgh. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday in early April, and she had read it twice standing in the corridor before carrying it to Adrian, who had read it once, looked at her face, and said, without hesitation, without the slight pause that would have told her he was managing his own response before presenting it, "When you leave?" That was the moment, if she was cataloging moments, when she understood completely and without remaining reservation what she felt for him. She left for Edinburgh in May. She returned in August. The arrangement they had built between them was unconventional by every measure that Regency England possessed for measuring such things, and they had agreed, without extensive discussion, that they did not particularly care. She wrote to him from Edinburgh with the same methodical regularity she applied to her case notes. He wrote back at length, letters that arrived thick with observations, questions about her studies, dry commentary on estate politics, and occasional passages of such unguarded honesty that she read them more than once in the quiet of her student lodgings and felt the distance between them as a specific, manageable ache. Her father's debt was long discharged. Reginald Ashwood had, in the intervening months, demonstrated a genuine, if imperfect, effort at reformation. She had received 3 letters from him, each more coherent than the last, the most recent containing the information that he had taken on a partner for the apothecary, and was sleeping better. She had written back. The conversation they had promised themselves was ongoing, unhurried, finding its shape. On a Friday evening in late September, Alara stood in the courtyard of Velmore Hall with her bags at her feet and the last of the summer light in her hair, watching Adrian cross the gravel toward her with the easy, unguarded stride of a man no longer in chronic pain. The shoulder had improved beyond her most optimistic projection. The tremors were gone. The headaches occasional and manageable. The man who had opened a door to her 11 months ago, fury bright, exhausted, braced for another abandonment, was present in him still, as all previous versions of a person remained present, but he wore it differently now. Integrated rather than dominated. He stopped in front of her. "How was the journey?" he asked. "Long," she said. "Entirely worth it." He took her bag from her shoulder with the ease of a habit established over months of exactly this. The small, consistent gestures of a partnership that had been built carefully and tested thoroughly, and had held. He did not make speeches. Neither did she. They had given each other enough words by now to understand that the words were for when they were needed, and that this moment did not need them. They walked inside together, into the warm light of a house that had remembered what it was for. Later that evening, in the study with the familiar fire and the books that had witnessed the beginning of everything, Alara opened her newest notebook to the first page. At the top, she wrote the date. Below it, in the precise clinical shorthand she had developed over years of practice, she wrote what she always wrote at the beginning of a new case: the presenting situation, the initial assessment, the treatment approach, the prognosis. Then she paused, and beneath it all, in her own plain handwriting rather than shorthand, she wrote, *patient presented, October, Velmore Hall. Diagnosis, incorrectly categorized. Treatment, ongoing. Prognosis, excellent, *. She looked at what she had written. She closed the notebook. Across the room, Adrian looked up from his book and met her eyes, and the expression on his face was the one she had been cataloging for nearly a year, the one that still had no clean clinical category, the one that sat outside the orderly taxonomy of symptoms and findings and measurable outcomes, the one that was simply irreducibly his. She smiled. He smiled back. Outside, the moor stretched on in the dark, ancient and indifferent and vast, and inside the lit windows of Velmore Hall 2 people sat together in the particular peace of those who have survived difficulty and chosen, with full knowledge of the cost, to remain.